Hello, everybody. Welcome to New Testament Survey. Today we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark and Luke. I know last week we were scheduled to be in Mark and to talk about the synoptic problem, and we spent so much time on that, which was fine. We just didn't get to Mark. So today we will move through Mark, which I kind of planned it that way because Mark is a short gospel. We can move through it fairly quickly, and then kind of the same with Luke. So much overlap in the synoptics that we're not going to go passage by passage with these books of the Bible anyway. So if you do have your Bibles there and you're following along, if you just want to go to the beginning of Mark, and we will do the same thing with Luke here in just a few minutes. But let's begin with Mark. The first phrase, Mark 1:1, it says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." That may well have been the original title. It was not called the Gospel according to Mark, these Gospels are kind of given to us anonymously. But we do believe that Mark is the author of the Gospel. And we're going to talk about who Mark is here in just a minute. You should have got last week emailed to you our little overview, just a one-page handout that says the Gospel according to Mark at the top. So we're going to talk about the person of Mark, and we're going to talk about the Gospel that he wrote. He doesn't give his name, but he is the undisputed author of the book. There's very few divergent theories of anybody thinking anybody else besides Mark wrote it. So when we call it the Gospel according to Mark, that is pretty well undisputed and taken there at face value. Mark is a frequent character in the gospel in the book of Acts. He's one of Paul's companions. He goes on a missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas. In fact, he's a cousin of Barnabas, and that's probably how he got involved in this missionary journey to begin with, was through Barnabas. And we don't really know much about what took place on that first trip, but we do know that somewhere along the way, Mark deserted the team. In Acts 13:13, it talks about that. And I don't know if he got homesick. I don't know if he became physically ill and just thought, you know what, I don't want to spend any more time on this ship. Maybe he got seasick and just said, I'm going home. Maybe he got burned out. Maybe he got scared. We don't know what took place. But Paul took it personally. When Mark decided that he no longer wanted to be a part of the team, when Mark decided he was going to leave them and head back home, to Paul it was more than just, shoot, I wish he was still here. Paul seems to be really offended by it. Paul seems to be angry. So when it comes to the place where they're going to go out on their next journey and Barnabas says, hey, Mark's going with us, and Paul says, no, he's not. And they begin to have an argument about it. And Barnabas defends his cousin, and Barnabas wants him to go, and Paul, in essence, Paul says, over my dead body. Paul's telling him, I'm not going if Mark goes. Mark is not going to be part of the team. He said that he deserted us, he wasn't there for us, he abandoned us. So much so that it unfortunately leads to a split between Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas is so invested in Mark, saying, me and Mark are going to go together. And Paul says, well, you and Mark can go. And Paul says, I'm going to go my way, y'all go your way, and that's what ends up happening. So it's unfortunate that Mark is the cause of a split between Paul and Barnabas. But if anything, it's a great picture of redemption. Because while Mark, early in his life, causes do you have a question? I don't know if your hand was going up. Okay. Well, early in his life, he's causing a split between Paul and Barnabas. I mean, the great missionary duo. But then later in his life, we see a completely different person. And this, to me, is what the Christian life is like so often. Where, yeah, we've made mistakes, especially in our younger days. But if we learn from those, if we grow from those, there's no limit to what God can still do with us if we're willing to learn and grow and mature. And I believe that's what happens to Mark. He matures. It could be because of Barnabas. Barnabas, his name, he's the son of encouragement. He's an encourager. That's what Barnabas does. And it could be that as they went along, and Mark might have been upset, thinking, man, this is all my fault, Barnabas. I'm sorry that you and your friend Paul are not on speaking terms right now. And he might have felt really bad, and Barnabas would say, hey, don't worry about it, Mark. It's going to be okay. Hey, Mark, I know you let us down, but you've grown from this, Mark, and you're going to do great things, Mark. And it could be that Barnabas spoke encouragement into Mark, and that could be part of what helped him grow up. It could be that Peter, the Apostle Peter, helped Mark grow up. We're going to talk about the relationship between Mark and Peter. But it could just be that maybe going out there, rolling up his sleeves and getting involved in the ministry on those missionary journeys, maybe that helped Mark grow up. We don't really know all what went into it, maybe a combination of all those things, but we know that later on, Peter referred to Mark as my son. Obviously not biologically, but he referred to him as my son Mark. And that would be a great honor for him to be called that. It's like saying, he's like a son to me. He's somebody that I've taken under my wing. He's somebody that has great potential, and I believe he's going to do great things. And I'd say that he did if he is the one who's given us the gospel here that bears his name. But what does Paul say about Mark later on in Paul's life? He's writing a letter to Timothy near the end of his life, and he's asking Timothy, hey, can you bring me my garment? Can you bring me some more writing materials? I've got some things I need to write down. But he says, can you take Mark and can you bring him along with you when you come to visit me? And what does he say about Mark in 2 Timothy 4? He says, he is useful to me for the ministry. What an amazing turnaround. In Acts 13, it's, no, if Mark goes, I'm not going. You know, Mark and I are not getting in the same boat. In 2 Timothy, it's, can you bring Mark? Because he's useful to me. In Acts, he has no use to me. In Acts, he's dead to me. In Acts, I don't want Mark anywhere around. In 2 Timothy, would you bring Mark? I need him. I can use him. He's a benefit to us. He's part of the team. And to me, that just speaks of God's redemption and amazing grace. And I think that this is always a picture. As often as I think about Paul and Barnabas or Mark, I think about how God can do that in any person's life. So whatever mistakes we might have made, let this guy show us, the author of this gospel, let him show us that God can use us, God can forgive us, and we are never done with, where Paul says, I have no need for him. He comes to a place where he says, I need him. And we never come to that place where we cannot be used because of our sin, because of our past mistakes. Paul would also tell the Colossians that Mark is a fellow worker or fellow laborer. He says he's been an encouragement to me. So again, a beautiful picture of redemption. So it's believed that Mark became a disciple of Peter. And it's believed that the information that he used to write the Gospel of Mark came from him listening to Peter preach. You know, Peter preached some great sermons. We have, Acts chapter 2, for example, recorded for us. But Peter continued to preach. Peter became a leader in the church. And as often as he preached, we get the sense that Mark was there listening. And so Peter would talk about Jesus. He would talk about some of the things that happened. Peter would no doubt tell stories about walking on water and feeding 5,000. And he would talk about, Jesus' miracles. He would talk about, rising from the dead and all these things. And Mark is sitting there listening. So, we had this discussion with the synoptic problem of, was there a Q gospel or, where did all get their sources? Well, I believe that while Mark probably did use some kind of written source like a Q gospel, I believe he got most of his material from just simply listening to Peter preach. In fact, Papias said that Mark was Peter's interpreter. Now there's a lot of debate into what an interpreter would be because we don't know what languages Mark may have spoken. We don't know if Peter was someplace where he needed an interpreter as if he's speaking another language, or we don't know if an interpreter is more maybe like a secretary, a recording secretary. Maybe he was writing down some things that Peter said and maybe helping explain some things that Peter said. We don't really know what that means, and that has been debated. But the fact that Papias called Mark Peter's interpreter, then coupled with the fact that Justin Martyr referred to the Gospel of Mark as the memoirs of Peter, I think those two things together kind of really make it seem like it's Mark's writing, but it's based on what Peter had to say. And then some of the other church fathers, Irenaeus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, they all agreed that Mark was the author. And then Eusebius said that Mark wrote the gospel at the request of Peter's followers. Maybe Peter had died, some people speculate, or was up in years, maybe not preaching as often as he had. And some of the people that had listened to Peter for so long went to Mark and said, hey, Mark, we know you were there for all those years with Peter. Could you do us a favor? Could you just write all that stuff down? Maybe just kind of put together a book, maybe write us a letter about all the things that Peter has been telling us. And if that's the case, then we certainly understand that Peter would have been a main source for the Gospel of Mark. So, any questions or anything so far? Excellent. All right. Now, let's talk about this. Mark was written, because we talked about Matthew, and that was 2 weeks ago, not last week. So we talked about the Jewishness of Matthew. We talked about how Matthew was a Jew writing to Jews. We talked about how Matthew went out of his way to point to Old Testament prophets, to quote the Old Covenant. How Matthew would talk about things that were just uniquely Jewish and things that he knew that his audience would understand. How his genealogy went, trace Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. All the things that Jews were looking for. Well, Mark was not a Jew, and Mark was not writing to Jews. So we see some things that are kind of unique to Mark based on who he was and who his audience was. Mark wrote to believers in Rome. A lot of people believe, and it's debated, but most people seem to believe that Peter ministered in Rome kind of for the remainder of his life after originally in Jerusalem, but then made his way to Rome. And that's where the rumors of Peter having been the first pope kind of originates, from the belief that he ended up in Rome. And so it's believed that Mark was there in Rome. Peter wasn't the first pope, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. But Mark was there with Peter in Rome, and so he wrote his letter most likely to Romans. But his audience was clearly non-Jewish. Now, that's not to say that Jews did not immediately read what Mark wrote, and that I believe, as we talked about Mark in priority, I believe that Mark's gospel is on the scene first. I believe that Matthew, the Jew writing to Jews, I believe Matthew was influenced by Mark's gospel. So I believe that Jews read it. I believe Jews benefited from it, but that was not his intended audience. He was a Gentile writing to Gentiles. He was writing specifically to the Christians gathered in Rome. And here's some of the things that we pick up just by going through the book. If you're there in chapter 1, where we've been, if you want to flip ahead to chapter 7, this is just a really classic example right here where Mark explains some Jewish customs, something that Matthew would not have to explain, because Matthew's audience understands these things and takes them for granted. But in Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, it says, "The Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him," Jesus, "having come from Jerusalem. Now, when they saw some of Jesus' disciples eat bread with defiled hands," and then he tells us, that is, with unwashed hands. See, if Matthew says your hands are defiled, the Jews know that means they haven't washed them. But Mark tells us defiled, that is, unwashed. They found fault. And so verses 3 and 4 right here are classic examples of Mark. It says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash their hands. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches." Matthew wouldn't have written any of that. He didn't need to. Matthew's audience understands when we come to the marketplace, we wash our hands, we wash our pitchers, we wash our copper, we wash our vessels. We don't eat with defiled hands. Mark has to explain that. Why are the Pharisees so upset that Jesus' disciples didn't wash their hands? People in Rome would be thinking, what's the big deal? Are they germaphobes? I mean, why would they care that these guys haven't washed? So Mark feels necessary to explain, and he probably learned this from Peter. Well, Peter, what's the big deal with y'all not washing your hands? Why'd they get upset at you guys for not washing your hands? And Peter says, oh, well, we're Jews. We have this custom, that this is what we do. Well, we are defiled. And so then Mark understands that he needs to explain this to his Roman audience. And so this is just a good example of how he has to explain some Jewish customs. In chapter 14, he does a similar thing by describing the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And in the very next chapter, he talks about the Day of Preparation. Romans don't know anything about the Jewish feasts. They don't know what the Day of Preparation is. Now, it was important that Jesus' body be taken down from the cross before sunset on Friday night, because once that happened, sunset, it became Saturday. Their days weren't midnight to midnight like ours. They were sunset to sunset, kind of loosely defined that way. And so we're told in the Gospels, his body had to come off the cross because it was the Day of Preparation. Makes perfect sense to a Jew, to a Roman. What's the Day of Preparation? Well, we're preparing to observe the Passover. And if we touch his dead body after sunset Friday, now it's Saturday, we will be defiled. We can't eat the Passover. And so Mark has to explain that to the Romans. It's the Day of Preparation. No bodies, no dead bodies can be touched. So we see him explaining some Jewish customs. Another marking feature is he provides no genealogy. We talked about Matthew's genealogy already. Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, Mark doesn't present any kind of genealogy. In a minute, we're going to get into Luke's genealogy once we get there. But why doesn't Mark give any genealogy? Well, simply, the Romans couldn't care less. The Romans didn't care, as we might say right here in the South. They don't care who your daddy was. You know, they don't care what family you're from. The Romans care about you. Okay, if you're going to write a story about somebody, you're going to write a story about Jesus, a biography. Tell us what Jesus did. We couldn't care less who his mother was, his father was. We don't care what line or tribe or family he came from. We want action. We want results. And the Romans were just driven like that. They were, militarily minded. They were mighty, and they wanted to know information about the person. They didn't care who Jesus' mother was, who his father was. They didn't need to see either line trace. And so that's why Mark doesn't waste any time any of the Romans' time with the genealogy, because they frankly wouldn't care. Also, he provides the fewest Old Testament references among all the Gospels. Now, to be fair, he's the shortest. And so when we say he does the fewest of anything, we take that into account. It's the shortest Gospel, so he probably would have the fewest anyway. But we see he's not as concerned with quoting the Old Testament. Not nearly as concerned with saying, oh, this is what the prophet said, quoting Hosea and Joel and all those guys. He also translates Aramaic. So let's test our Aramaic. All right? The first one in parentheses, Boanerges in chapter 3, verse 17. Anybody familiar with that off the top of your head? Boanerges. That was James and John. The Bible says that they were nicknamed by Jesus the sons of thunder. In Aramaic, it's Boanerges. And so you see that in some Gospels. Mark translates that because his Roman audience would not be familiar with Aramaic. So he tells them, not only did Jesus nickname them Boanerges, whereas Matthew doesn't need to translate that for us, Mark does translate that and says that is sons of thunder. So that was their nickname. That's in chapter 3, verse 17. Chapter 5, verse 41. Talitha Kumai. Anybody remember that one? That is, little girl, I say to you, arise. In chapter 5, verse 41, it says, then he took the child, Jesus, took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kumai, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. She had died, and Jesus brought her back to life. And Mark translates that for his audience. Surely you know the next one. Korban, chapter 7, verse 11. Jesus is scolding the Pharisees, and he says, you just say it is Korban. That is, it is a gift. Remember the Pharisees made this loophole for themselves, where the scriptures and the law says that they're to honor their parents, to take care of their parents, but the Pharisees don't want to spend a nickel taking care of their parents. And so they say, this money is Korban. That is a gift that is dedicated to God. So the loophole, instead of having to take care of your physical parents, is to say, yeah, no, I'm giving this money to the church. I'm giving this money to the Lord's service. And so that's what they would say. We don't have to take care of our parents because we're claiming it as a gift. The next one, and this one's just frankly hard to say, and I'll probably have to try it twice, but Ephphatha. I'm not even sure if I'm getting that right, but double PH right there always messes with me. In chapter 7, verse 34, that one is much trickier, but in 7:34, that's where Jesus says, be opened. He's talking to someone who is deaf and mute. If you're there in chapter 7, verse 34, then looking up to heaven, he sighed, and he said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loose, and he spoke plainly. Next one, y'all know this one. Chapter 14, verse 36, Abba. What does Abba mean? Anybody? Father. There you go. I knew something. If I just stood here long enough, someone's going to say Father. Yeah, Abba, Father. That's one that is left untranslated by some, but Mark lets us know when Jesus says Abba, he's talking to his Father. People debate what the word Abba means. It's hard. Translation is just hard in general. But I think the best way, if we just wanted absolute apples for apples, English equivalent, it would be like saying daddy. Now, some people don't like that, and I understand. But it kind of depends on what you call your own father. See, some people that they run up to their dad and maybe as a toddler, and they say father, and that might sound really formal to us. But for some people, that's what they call him. So some people say daddy, dad, maybe a nickname. but Abba would be like whatever the most familiar, the most comfortable term that you would use with your own father. Now, if you had a bad relationship with your father, and that brings up a negative connotation in your mind, then I understand that. But the idea of Abba is to really embrace that idea that God is not a bad relationship, that he's a good father, that he's somebody that we can run up to with open arms and say, Abba, like a child might run up and say, Daddy. And so to me, I've read so many different people that have tried to translate this, define it, to try to make a good English equivalent. And I think it's hard to do because we have so many ways of speaking of our own biological or earthly fathers that it really varies from person to person how this word connects with us. But to me, I got the best definition I ever needed when I was in New York a couple of years ago. We went in December. We were there. We wanted to see the whole Rockefeller Center and you see the Christmas tree and all that stuff there. And it was, while we were there, it was Passover week. And so the Passover, I could be wrong here, but I think it ended on a Sabbath. And so it was Sunday. We were out, and the Jews who had been inside, and in New York City, there's a very large Jewish population. And so the Jews had all been inside because of the Passover. They were observing strict Sabbath laws, not driving, not walking, or any of those things. And so they had all been inside. And so the next day, they were out everywhere. Everybody we saw seemed had yarmulkes on, and looked like they had a little cabin fever, and they all just wanted to get outside. And so we went to a place to get a slice of pizza. And fantastic, by the way. I highly recommend a slice of pizza in New York. But there was a Jewish family in there, and the man, the families were all sitting down, and like even my wife was sitting down, and I was waiting to get our pizza to carry it to the table. And so after we had done that, there was a man that had been waiting behind me. I mean, he had the yarmulke, the full beard. I mean, he just looked like a Jew's Jew, like the Apostle Paul probably. And so he got his pizza, he was carrying it to the table beside us, and all these little kids were there. And you know how kids get when they see pizza. And so he comes walking around with his pizza, and this little boy at the table right beside us, he starts saying, Abba, 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 and he was reaching his hands up like that, and it was like, I will never debate what that word means again. I just picture that little boy looking at his dad carrying pizza, and that image to me defines that word. And so Mark tells us here, Abba, that is Father. Well, I never called my dad Father. I don't know if you called, your dad's Father, but so Mark even tries to translate it, but then even that, I think it's still lost in translation, because if you call him Daddy still to this day, that's one thing I've loved about moving to Union. I realized that grown men call their fathers Daddy, or Dee, as most people say up here. Being from Orlando, that really just struck me when I first moved here. I heard these men would look at their dads and say, hey, Daddy. And I was like, man, like in Florida, guys start calling their dads Daddy at like age 4 or 5. It's not manly, So everybody's different. Cultures are different. But Mark explains Abba for us here. And I think it's such an important concept that we understand God as our Father. Not just as our disciplinarian, not just as our judge, not just as our Lord, but to really embrace that father-child relationship. Because as Chris Tomlin has told us, he's a good, good father. That's who he is. That's who he is. And that's a great song, but it's a great truth. And Mark translates that for us. The next one in 1522, Golgotha, or Golgotha is a little bit closer to it. Golgotha is translated, anyone? The place of the skull, that's right. The place of the skull, that's the part of the Passion story here, and that brings us to the next one. In chapter 15, verse 34, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And that's what Jesus says on the cross. Anyone? Well, this is, close, right after. My God, why have you forsaken me? And that's, you just spend an hour on that topic right there with the thought of God turning his back on Jesus because Jesus was bearing our sin. You talk about how bad Mark might have felt to know that he drove a wedge between Paul and Barnabas, but then think about what our sin did between the Father and the only begotten Son. We had to turn his back, and Jesus says, why have you forsaken me? And how alone he must have felt on the cross. His mom's down there, John's down there. A thief beside him is confessing him as Lord. A Roman centurion is recognizing him as the Son of God, but his Father has turned his back. And that had to be the worst moment in all of Jesus' existence. So Mark translates these Aramaic phrases for us. We appreciate that. The next thing he does, he uses the Roman system to calculate time. In chapter 6, verse 48. I don't know if you guys are flipping to any of these things that are in parentheses and things here, but in chapter 6, verse 48, this is an interesting thing that Mark does here too. It says, then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. And so the fourth watch was 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So I'd be straining too, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Y'all be asleep between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., but not fishermen. You know, that's a good time for them to go about their business, to fish through the night. And Mark uses the Roman system of measuring time. The Roman centurions, the Roman soldiers that marched, and they had watches, kind of like their, what do you need? In my wallet. Yep. But the Roman soldiers, because they patrolled, basically, they had their watches, and so it was common for them to measure their time based on those, kind of like a shift, we might say. And so that's one thing that Mark does. Then he uses Latin, where the other synoptic writers do not. So in chapter 5, verse 9, legion, anybody familiar with that one? There's, we talked about this actually in Matthew too, the man that was demon-possessed. And so when Jesus asks his name, he says, we are legion. And then Mark tells us, for we are many. He translates that. Mark says we are legion, and the synoptic writers translate it into we are many. Whereas the Romans would be more familiar with Latin than the Greek. So Mark is content to just leave it at legion, and the Matthew and Luke let us know that means many. And in the Praetorium in 1516, the Praetorium was the house there where we can turn and look at. This is the last one. We'll just look at this and then we'll go to Luke. So in chapter 15, verse 16, the soldiers led Jesus away to the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison. And this is, of course, when Jesus is going before Pilate, and then when he goes to Pilate's house there. That's what that is. So he doesn't need to translate that for us. He just tells us it's the Praetorium, and the other synoptic writers let us know what that is. So Mark is short and to the point. He leaves out the long discourses found in Matthew and Luke, and instead he uses short excerpts. He might talk about the same event as Matthew or Luke, but instead of giving us the whole long script, he may just give us, one sentence from it. He uses the word immediately more than the other three, not just Matthew and Luke, but John as well, more than the other three Gospels combined. So Mark again is about action, and that's what the Romans wanted. And so Mark, he immediately did this, and then immediately he did that, and Mark just keeps the story moving because the Romans, that's what they want to see. It's like a good action movie. They want to see the story keep moving. They don't want to get bogged down in the long sermons and the parables even that Matthew and Luke provide. The climax is chapter 8, verse 29. It's interesting that this comes right at the middle of the gospel, and it's the high point. So I think Mark did this on purpose. I think he, right at the halfway point, he has Peter's great confession. Well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that is the climax of Mark. I think that's the high point. That's the main thing Mark wanted everybody to know. He wanted the followers of Peter, those Christians in Rome, and everybody else to know that Jesus was the Christ. And isn't it interesting that as Peter's kind of disciple, as the one gaining his information from Peter, that the climax of his gospel is Peter's confession of faith. Not something John said, not something one of the other disciples did, but Peter's great confession. And I think that might have been a nod to his mentor Peter, but I think that was just because that's really what the gospel is about, that they may know that he is the Christ. So any questions on Mark before we get into Luke? Well, all right. Well, let's go to Luke. Yeah, I'm sorry. That was apologies. I thought I had done this. There you go.
Well, that's on my mind.
Yes. No, go
I
ahead.
was just wondering, how many popes, does the Bible say how many popes
Well, no. The office of Pope is a man-made invention. It's not biblical. We, as Southern Baptists, we reject the papacy in general. I don't think the Pope is. I don't think there should be a Pope. I think it's part of a perverted. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I agree.
Yeah.
It's just it was mentioned and it threw me into that.
Oh yeah, no. The Bible doesn't use any kind of term for Pope or anything like that. So there, you would find anything referring to the papacy at all. All right. I failed to pass out the Luke handout. If you didn't catch that on the video, that's what I was doing there, giving our handout on Luke. So hopefully you got in an email a handout on Luke too, and we will now go through that if you have that handy. The Gospel of Luke is the longest book in the New Testament. That may be surprising because it doesn't have the most chapters, but it's the longest as far as content goes. And so if you take Luke, which is lengthy, and then you add to that Acts, which was also written by Luke, together you have the man Luke writing about 25% of the entire New Testament. Just Luke and Acts together is about a quarter of the whole New Testament. So Luke was busy. Luke has given us a lot, and we're going to try to grab some of the highlights of it here as well. Like the others, he does not identify himself as the author. But according to John MacArthur, he says the unanimous testimony of the early church is that Luke wrote the third gospel. More importantly, he says no alternative author was ever proposed. And I think the second part of that sentence is of utmost importance, because it would be one thing if everybody said, well, I think Steve over here wrote it, and then there's a big movement that whoever Steve would be wrote. I just made that name up, but there's no other alternative. It's either Luke or it's nobody. We don't have any other guesses here. And so if nothing else, for lack of a better option on the table, we go with Luke because he's the only option on the table. It's like Mark, pretty much undisputed, what MacArthur called the unanimous testimony. The early church, the people that were reading it right off the bat, they all believed it was Luke. Everybody seemed to agree. Furthermore, since this is a good point right here that I want you to think about, the Gospels of the Apocrypha were attributed to well-known figures, typically the apostles and early church leaders. So why would somebody choose Luke to be the author of a fake gospel? In other words, if somebody's making up their own book of the Bible, what would be common is to say, John the Baptist wrote this, or the Apostle Paul wrote this, or just pick somebody that was kind of popular. But Luke was never popular. So if somebody's saying, oh, Luke wrote this, that doesn't really seem like a scam somebody would try to pull, because nobody was really all that familiar with who Luke was until we really get into the book of Acts when we meet Luke. In fact, Luke's name only appears 3 times in the Bible, and it's not in the book of Luke. In fact, it's not even in the book of Acts. He doesn't ever write his own name. Colossians 4, 2 Timothy 4, and Philemon 24 each mention Luke, and Paul is the one mentioning his name. So Luke was not a popular figure, so he'd hardly be the kind of person they would try to pin a fake gospel on. I think one of the greatest evidence, though, for Luke and authorship is the use of the so-called we passages in the book of Acts. What I mean by the we passages is, and we're going to spend time in Acts here in a couple of weeks, but I guess 2 weeks. We'll do John next week and then Acts after that. And then after Acts, we'll start, kind of like we're doing today, start doing at least 2 New Testament books at a time. But the we passages of Acts, you have a narrator writing the book of Acts. He's writing, what each person's doing. And then occasionally, he changes from saying, they did this to, we did this. And then he goes back to, and then Paul went on and did this, and then we met up with Paul. And so using a process of elimination, we'll talk more about it in Acts, but knowing all of Paul's companions, when he'd name all the others, but never names himself, and then he says we, by saying, okay, it wasn't Barnabas, it wasn't Mark, it wasn't Timothy, and so we kind of whittle that down, and we're really only left with Luke. And so that seems to be probably the key piece of evidence. And then, especially when we talk about it being both books addressed to Theophilus, because you say, okay, that's Acts, but what does that have to do with the book of Luke? They're both addressed to the same person. We'll talk about Theophilus in a second. But Paul called Luke the beloved physician. And so from that, we believe Luke to have been a medical doctor. A lot of people think that Paul and Luke met when they were both students at the university that was located in Tarsus. We don't know that either of them attended that university, but Paul is from Tarsus. Remember, he was Saul of Tarsus, that's what he's known by. So Paul was highly educated, and if he's from Tarsus, he probably went and studied at the university that was there. We know he was very highly educated. And Luke, having been a physician and from in that same area, if he had any kind of higher education, it most likely would have been there. So a lot of people think they probably both went to school there. That's probably how they got to know each other. Maybe they overlapped. Maybe they became friends there. Of course, we can't know that for sure. But it is kind of fun to picture Paul and Luke sharing a dorm room somewhere in the university, having some pizza for breakfast and all that fun stuff. But we don't know. Now, the Gospel of Acts, let's look at the first couple of verses here. Luke, the Gospel of Acts, it doesn't exist. The Gospel of Luke, it says, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." Those 4 verses there give us a lot of information as we try to unpack this gospel before we even start to get into it. But he addresses it there, "To you, most excellent Theophilus." Now, Theophilus is a transliteration of a Greek word that means lover of God. That would be a really good name, for Christian parents to name their child lover of God. And that may well be what happened here. There may be a literal, and I believe this to be the case. I believe there's a literal person named Theophilus, named lover of God. But it is worth entertaining a couple of other theories. It could be that this was a code name. Perhaps somebody who, for whatever reason, needed to stay undercover. Luke didn't want his real name to get out because a person that could have faced persecution, a person who could have been ostracized from their family or their community. So he used a code name, "You're a lover of God, and I'm writing you this letter." So instead of identifying who this person was, as some people think the nature of the name lover of God may be the kind of person he was writing to, not necessarily the name of the person he was writing to. And then others believe it could refer to a whole group of people, maybe like an underground kind of church, a whole movement of people that were identified here as if it's a person who maybe doesn't exist, and that way the government or whoever can't come tracking down, where's this Theophilus fella? And maybe he didn't exist, maybe it was a group of believers, and Luke wanted them to have this information. All of those are fine theories. I happen to go with the most obvious, that he's a real person who just happens to be named lover of God, because the name of God appears in so many names. A lot of people incorporated God's name, especially the minor prophets. We see how many of them have God's name tied into theirs. But for Theophilus, who was not a Jew, you might say, well, hang on, he's not Jewish. It's typically the Jews putting God's name into their names, but God is the broader term, not the name Yahweh. And so Gentiles who converted were called God-fearers. They were not full-on Jews, and then the name Christian didn't exist yet. And so they were fearers of God, or God-fearers. So to call your child a lover of God, if you're two God-fearing Gentile parents who converted to the faith, then the name Theophilus would make perfect sense. It would be a simple Greek way of basically giving some praise to God through your child's name. So if Theophilus was just one individual, he may have been a very important person. Because what does he call him? Most excellent Theophilus. Now that's a pretty nice title, isn't it? To be called most excellent. It could be that he was a person of rank, maybe an elected official, and maybe again, if he is an elected official, a Roman aristocrat, maybe a Roman centurion or something, maybe he did need to remain anonymous as he went about his daily job. Maybe he was high up in the Roman government and he didn't want it getting out that he was a believer. And so maybe he uses a way of nodding to his rank, but then giving him an anonymous name. We don't know. But again, I do stick with he was just one person named Theophilus. No matter the original addressee, Luke certainly had a broad audience in mind. I believe he was writing to one person, but I believe he also expected that this one letter that he's writing, or two eventually, that they would be read by a lot of people. It's not just going to be Theophilus reading this. Even if Theophilus is a whole underground church, it won't just be them. I think Luke had a universal approach in mind, that he wanted this gospel to be something Jews could read, Romans could read, Greeks, Gentiles from around the world, that anybody could read this and benefit from it. The introduction, which we just read, the first 4 verses, it follows a classic pattern in Hellenistic literature. If you notice some of these key things, he recognizes his predecessors, and that's how he begins right off the bat. Inasmuch as many, his predecessors, have taken in hand to set in order a narrative. He, and this is very common in Hellenistic literature, recognizes predecessors. He lays out his purpose for writing. He says, here's what I want to do. I want to give you an orderly or a chronological, a systematic account. And then he acknowledges the recipient of his work. He mentions Theophilus down there 3 verses in, or 3 verses in. And so that's the way writing in this time period, the Greek Hellenists, the way that they wrote. And so he follows that pattern there precisely. Luke is a person who pays attention to detail. Being a physician, whether he's a medical doctor, like I believe that he was, or a historian. A lot of people think that maybe he studied history or studied literature. He's a very good writer, but he really pays attention to detail. And so just right away, the way he begins his gospel shows us that he was very careful to make sure he was doing it right. He says he wants to write an orderly account. And what's interesting is his gospel is the most chronological. Remember Matthew? I said Matthew's the most anachronistic. Matthew gets it all out of order, and that's completely fine in ancient biographies. But Luke doesn't. Luke doesn't want to get it out of order. He's allowed to, but he says, I want to write to you an orderly account. He says, as much as many have already, and I believe that Mark had already written his gospel, Luke had probably read Mark's gospel. He says, as much as many people have already written to give you information, I want to give you an orderly account. So it's kind of like Luke is saying, I've done a lot of research here, and I've figured out the actual timeline. I've got the actual chronology, and I want to put this in the order it happened. I want to present Jesus from his birth. I want to present Jesus from his childhood, his ministry, all the way to the passion, the crucifixion. I want to do this in order. And he tells Theophilus why. He says, so that you, Theophilus, may know with certainty these things. Perhaps Theophilus was struggling with something. I've read all these things, but this person says it this way, and this person says it that way, and maybe Luke says, I want to write it to you exactly like it was, so you won't have any doubts about the way that it happened. So if you want to get the most chronological, the most systematic of the Gospels, it's certainly the one that Luke gives us, and he tells us that that's why he's doing it. Now, he was a Gentile, writing to a Gentile, or possibly to Gentiles, but Luke approaches his work from a universal standpoint. So, let's talk about the genealogy. His genealogy goes all the way back to Adam. Remember Matthew? Jesus is the son of Abraham, or the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's as far back as he needs to go. Because to the Jews, Abraham is our father. If you are a child of Abraham, then you are from the right race if you're a Jew. Luke is not writing to Jews. He wants to be universal, so he goes back to the father of all mankind, and he goes all the way back to Adam, whose name means man, the very first person. So he gives a very universal approach to his genealogy. Among the synoptics, he gives the fullest picture of the life of Jesus. He sets the stage very well. Matthew begins by saying the book of the genealogies of Jesus Christ, and he goes into the genealogies. Well, next thing you know, Jesus is coming to get baptized by John, and he goes out in the wilderness. Well, Luke does a much better job of setting the stage. He's giving a broader background for everything that's taking place. He explains to us why Joseph needed to go to Bethlehem. He explains the tax, the decree that went out from Caesar Augustus. And he gives us, the angel visiting Mary and Joseph. He gives us even the birth narrative of John the Baptist. He's the only one that shows us that the Zechariah and Elizabeth, about how Zechariah can't speak until he names the child John. And Luke gives us all of that, kind of setting up not only Jesus, but who John the Baptist is, showing us that they have a familial relation, so that when Jesus goes to be baptized by John, the two really already knew each other. John leaps in the womb with excitement when he finds out that Mary is pregnant. And so Luke is including all of that extra information that the others don't give us. The telling of the birth narrative of Jesus. Matthew talks about the birth, but it's nothing like the way Luke describes the birth. The way Luke describes the birth, in my opinion, he could win an award, a literary award, for the way that he writes out all of Luke 2. It's just such an incredible chapter, one that we tend to read at Christmas, and rightfully so. But all the details he gives, the way he describes it, even what's known as Mary's Magnificat, that's Latin, but it's, my soul rejoices, and it's this whole song that Mary sings after the birth of Jesus, and only Luke records that. Also, he's the only writer to include details about Jesus as a child. Now, we have the circumcision of Jesus on the 8th day, but then the next time we see Jesus in the other Gospels, he's a grown man. Only Luke has him. Of course, he's 12. He's not a little kid. But only Luke records the incident where he's in the temple. His parents can't find him, and they go back. Hey, we were worried sick. And he says, well, don't you know I had to be about my Father's business? And Luke is the only one that includes a little bit of boyhood Jesus in there before we get. And I know that's not a whole lot. That certainly doesn't fill in all the gaps in Jesus' life. But that's probably all that Luke was really able to come up with through all of his investigating and research that he did. And he included that for us. Some purely Lucan material. In chapter 7, he raises the widow's son in Nain. That's a fun city to say. And then now, some of the classic Luke material right here. In chapter 10, beginning in verse 25, we have the Good Samaritan. Where would we be if we didn't have the Good Samaritan? Isn't that just a classic Bible passage? And we don't get that from Matthew or Mark or John. We only get the Good Samaritan from Luke. Verse 25 of Luke chapter 10. Behold, a certain lawyer. So I hear you turning your pages like in a second. We're not going to read the whole thing here, but the context of it, what sets it up, it says, behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested Jesus, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said to him, What is written in the law? What is your reading? So he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? See, a lot of times we forget that's the context that sets up the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is a great story. We have the religious leaders that were too busy being religious to stop and help this guy. They just kind of step around him or step over him or go out of the way, like, I don't have time to mess with this guy. I got to get to church, and they're religious, but they don't stop to help someone who's been beaten up and left for dead on the side of the road. I don't care how religious you are. If you don't have compassion on someone laying there dying, then how good is your religion? But of all people, a Samaritan, not a Jew, but a Samaritan, the one that's so despised by the Jews. And he's the one that stops and helps. But that is an answer to the question, who is my neighbor? We need to never forget that is the context of the Good Samaritan. Because what does he say right before that? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, well, who's my neighbor? Because according to the Jews, your neighbor was such a broad term. We typically use a neighbor to refer to the person who lives next door to us. We might say my next door neighbor. But my neighbor might live on my street. They might live down the road from me. That's my neighbor. To the Jews, though, the neighbor was such a broad term. It means anyone that you might even bump into throughout the course of the day. If we interact for just a second, we're neighbors in this moment. So who's my neighbor? Well, if you see someone beaten up and left for dead, he's your neighbor. And which one acted like a neighbor? Not the priest, not the scribe, but the Samaritan. He acted like a neighbor. That's how we were supposed to treat each other. Our enemies, the ones who hate us, the ones who get under our skin, that's how we are supposed to view them, like the Good Samaritan. I appreciate Luke for giving us the Good Samaritan, because that is so important to our understanding of what it really means to love our neighbor as ourselves. And we do people an injustice when we teach this in children's church and Sunday school, when we preach it from our pulpits, all about the Good Samaritan, but we don't first show that question, who is my neighbor? Well, I'm going to answer that question. And he does it with the story of the Good Samaritan. So that tells us who our neighbor is, and we always need to make sure we include that, because that's the application of the Good Samaritan. The application is, who is my neighbor? Also, the prodigal son in chapter 15. No way we can read all of that there in the prodigal son, so we won't. but that's only found in Luke. The parable of the dishonest manager, the rich man and Lazarus. I don't believe that's a parable, but that's another topic for another day. Only found in Luke. It gives us a good picture of hell, of paradise. The encounter with Zacchaeus in chapter 19. Only Luke records Zacchaeus. Jesus asking his father to forgive the executioners in chapter 23. Telling the thief he would be with me, you would be with me today in paradise. And then the conversation on the Emmaus Road. Jesus walked with these two guys. They didn't understand why Jesus had to die. And beginning with Moses, it says, Jesus goes all the way back to the Old Testament. People say, oh, the Old Testament's not important. We have Jesus now. Jesus went back to Moses and he explained to them why the Son of God needed to die, which is an amazing thought. If we believe that Mark wrote first and then Luke relied on Mark, then Mark accounts for about 40% of Luke's gospel. So about 40% of the gospel of Luke is, I believe, first found in Mark. That means 60% of Luke came from something other than Mark. We talked last week about the L gospel. There certainly could be an L gospel. It is believed that Luke conducted his own interviews to gather material. So some have suggested maybe there was what's known as a proto-Luke. And proto-Luke is just a first Luke. Basically, they think that Luke did a bunch of research, interviews, came up with a bunch of information, and then he wrote a gospel that was very short. Then he moved to Rome while he was with Paul, and it was there he found the Gospel of Mark. And after reading the Gospel of Mark, he went back and added a lot more to his gospel, and then gave us the Gospel of Luke. We don't know if there was a proto-Luke, but the composition of it seems to indicate that there probably was. How the information that comes from Mark is put in large chunks together. And then the parts that are purely unique to Luke are kind of, put around it. So it seems that he had his own book, and then he got all this from Mark, and he just kind of shoved it right there in the middle. And so that does really lend credibility to the idea of a proto-Luke. So we could think of proto-Luke, if it exists, as more like a rough draft. Like he had it, didn't have a whole lot of information to it, and then he got his material from Mark and he added to it. Very quickly, keeping in mind that Luke was a physician, it's interesting that he's the only synoptic writer to mention that Peter cut off the right ear of Malchus. Matthew and Mark both say he cut off Malchus' ear. Luke says he cut off the right ear, something that a doctor would have picked up on, right? He's the only writer to mention Jesus sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, something that would have been intriguing to a doctor. Matthew and Mark both wrote that Peter's mother-in-law had a fever, but Dr. Luke says it was a high fever. And then the others describe a woman with the issue of blood. Luke is the only one that says there was no known cure for her condition, something Luke would have known. And the fact that as a doctor he tells us there's no cure really adds to the miracle of what Jesus did. Her touching the hem of his garment. And Luke says there's no cure. Believe me, I'm a doctor. Or what the Dr. Pepper commercials say, trust me, I'm a doctor. There's no cure for this until she touches the hem of his garment, and she's immediately healed. The Greekness of Luke is seen in his substituting Greek for Jewish titles. For example, he says teacher instead of rabbi. We see the Greekness of Luke in the Adamic versus Abrahamic reference in the genealogy, going all the way back to Adam versus Abraham. His omission of a lot of Matthean material about the Jewish law. A lot of stuff Matthew writes and Luke just leaves it out because it wasn't necessary to his audience. And he frequently gave parenthetical notes about Israel's geography. I thought about listing those out there. There's probably 6 or 7 times where, kind of in parentheses, Luke would explain where something was located because he knew Theophilus and the rest of his audience doesn't know the geography of Israel, and so he included that for him. And then finally, Luke uses the title Son of Man more than any other gospel, emphasizing the humanity of Jesus, also the universality of the offer of salvation. So Luke really focuses on Jesus being the Son of Man, as Matthew presents him as the King of Israel, and Luke shows his humanity as the Son of Man. So just one of those really uniquely Lucan features. So next week we will do John and kind of wrap up the Gospels, talk about why there are 4 Gospels. We've talked about how we have the 3 synoptics. We'll talk about why we have the 4 Gospels and how together they all 4 give us a good overview. But any questions or comments about Luke before we wrap it up here? Well, I emailed out the homework yesterday. You should have that. Let me tell the online students first. Spring break will be April 7th, not April 14th. The syllabus says April 14th. We're going to do it to coincide with Union County Schools. That might help some of you parents that may have kids in the schools, or you youth pastors, or whatever the case is. So April 7th, if that's a problem, sorry, but I get to pick it. So April 7th, not April 14th, will be spring break.